And I see a few familiar faces, actually several. Old times are resurrecting themselves in the Department of Natural Resources in Sacramento. So I have a particular point of view and a particular approach to these issues that has come through working on the discovery of the hybridization of non-native Spartina, Spartina alterniflora, and other species in San Francisco Bay with the native California cordgrass, Spartina foliosa. And my colleague, especially my colleague Deborah Ayers, who's here, and I have often called this the ecological and evolutionary misadventures of invasive Spartina. And they happen by seed reproduction, and they happen by the proliferation of vegetative reproduction. So I have to give credit to many who've worked on this project, and I have special thanks to Deborah Ayers, who is here today. She has led the charge with the hybridization work and was the senior author of many publications on this extraordinarily interesting phenomenon, the invasion of hybrid Spartina in San Francisco Bay. And she and I have summarized a great deal of this work, and I think there's reference to every one of our papers in this annual review of ecology, evolution, and systematics. And if any of you are having trouble getting it, send me an email and I will send it to you. So the outline today, I'll talk a little bit about the biology of Spartina, more about their introductions, invasions, hybridization, and evolution after invasions and hybridizations. And this group is especially interested in the conservation consequences of these invasions and hybridizations. And the control is also an extremely interesting issue that plays into the concern for management and policy of invasive Spartina. So the picture can be summarized in this slide. In the upper left, we see the native Atlantic situation of low energy, of estuarine intertidal situations almost everywhere in the western Atlantic. There is a Spartina that occupies the intertidal of low energy beaches. In the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, the situation is different. The native situation is there is no intertidal plant, and what we're talking about are mid-latitudes, temperate and subarctic zones. In equatorial regions, of course, mangroves occupy the intertidal throughout the world. So this is a shot from New Zealand. It could be a shot from China before it was invaded. It could be a shot from many places on the Pacific coast of North and South America. It could even be a shot in San Francisco Bay if we drew a little green line for native California cordgrass right along the edge here. I'm not adroit with this mouse. So after invasions, we have the native Western Atlantic situation, as we saw in the previous slide, and the invaded Pacific situation. And in the lower right, I'll finish up and explain this slide. In the background, you can see mangroves. In China is the only place where Spartina is invading mangroves. In the rest of the world, mangroves are displacing Spartina as they move poleward with global warming. Very, very interesting situation in China. So the biology is thusly, Deborah and I have written on this with our colleagues in France, Lily Anouche and others. It's a grass. There were 13 original species. There were 13 species in 1491, the year before the Columbian Exchange. There were 11 New World Atlantic natives in the Western Atlantic. There's one Pacific species, California cordgrass, Spartina foliosa. There was one Southern Ocean species, Spartina arundinacea, that grows 6-8 feet tall on islands in the Southern Ocean and penguins nest on top of it. Darwin recorded it. It's really a spectacular species. And there are multiple hybrid species and swarms that we have created. There are no invasions and no hybridizations in the central range in the western Atlantic. And the inference there that I think we could discuss without a bottle of wine, but even go farther into it, is the reason for this is that the habitat is occupied by native species that exclude by competition these other species. There are some interesting almost invasions, and they are extremely instructive. Not for today, we don't have enough time. Then outside the native range, there are big invasions and big hybridizations. There are a few species with huge influence. These are massively powerful ecological engineers. Lily Anouche, our French colleague in her colorful English, calls these the notorious invasive species. These invaders are part and parcel of the hybridization and the invasion afterwards. Spartina is wind-pollinated. There's little or no selfing in nature. Hybrids evolve selfing, as Deborah and Christina Sloop and the laboratory demonstrated in San Francisco Bay. Spartina spreads by seed that floats on the tide. There's no seed bank. This is a shot of John Lambrinos from Oregon State University, and we're in Willapa Bay, Washington here, and that rack mat is broken Spartina seeds in winter, and we follow those mats by spraying them with spray paint and noting their arrival on shore, and then in the next tide they'd pick up and move away, leaving seed behind them with germination in the following spring every place that they land. It's an ecological engineer. It changes the environment, the physical and the chemical environment where it grows. In native areas, it does this by, over time immemorial, building intertidal lands by trapping sediment. It has extremely high primary and secondary productivity. It actually determines the species composition of plants and animals. Spartina in native areas is the base of elaborate food webs that are very important to us and to other species as well. Its influence extends far beyond the estuaries where it serves as nursery grounds for animals. In introduced areas, it blocks upland drainage into estuaries, caused a lot of damage in San Francisco Bay before we started studying how to control it. An amusing story on A here, when Deborah and I first got into this work, there was a fellow from the Contra Costa mosquito management district, I believe, South Bay, who contacted us and told us that that weed growing in the Estudillo flood control channel near Oakland had blocked the rain runoff during an Oakland Raiders game and made the parking lot 2 inches deep in muddy water. And my son, who was a football fan, told me that they call that place the Black Hole because that's where the Oakland Raiders in black gather before and after the game. And some of them get so drunk they don't even make it into the game. And anyway, so it is rumored, and I can't find this, but it is rumored that an East Bay weekly newspaper had a headline that says, "Black Hole becomes mud hole." And so lots and lots of money in the early days was spent trying to spray this stuff, and they didn't know how to kill it. It increases intertidal elevation and channelizes salt marshes where it colonizes, changes the species composition. The environmental concerns are all the ones you would expect: conservation of animals and plants, human access to the shore, mariculture, fishing, and navigation. These play out differently in different estuaries and different countries. But the history of Spartina is that it probably a large fraction of the introductions were purposeful. Some were not. We know that some were not. The potential to terrestrialize the shore was the rationale. People wanted to to graze animals and farm in that mud down there where they couldn't even walk. We see some shots here from various places where we've studied Spartina. In the upper left, Willapa Bay, each of those patches is a aggressively growing clone of Spartina. You can see the house, that white house along the shoreline, a hunting lodge. And this entire area was rapidly becoming supertidal from intertidal. On the right, we see a shot of where we herbicided one of those clones, and you can see after a decade after invasion, the sediment had accumulated to raise the level of the land about 10 centimeters. In the lower left, there's a Spartina alterniflora in Willapa Bay violating the statutes of the state of Washington, which it is against the law to transform intertidal lands into supertidal lands. Scofflaw. And on the right, we see Cheney Seville digging away here at Peat Island of Spartina that had been created in Willapa Bay, Washington. That her 3/4 of her 5'5" height is root mat of Spartina that grows on top of one another and serially accumulating sediment and growing up. This is the latest invasion we know of in South Africa. Janice Adams' work, you see it's pretty fine real estate, and the Spartina alterniflora invading and transforming subtidal into intertidal lands. So the story about how all these invasions happened is long and it's multifaceted, but one part of it, the 20th century, is particularly interesting. And New Zealand is an advanced, highly educated country that wrote everything down. And so in 1949, one can find publications, and this is from the New Zealand Farmer, publication by Harbord. For thousands of years, these unsightly, treacherous waste flats have been an unconquerable challenge. And they advocated spreading this stuff, Spartina townsendii, around to conquer this, this waste area. But by 1965, in a more substantial publication than the New Zealand Farmer, Blick wrote, however, farmers have to be warned that there are adverse influences for spreading this stuff around, and it may not be obvious or apparent while you're doing it. Going on to 2004, it was full-scale herbicide application in New Zealand. They had renewed appreciation of estuarine wetlands in their natural states. They were losing species like mad, including the charming little pukeko, which is one of their favorite, one of the most absolutely charming, lovable little birds you've ever seen, about this tall with great big long orange legs. Those of you who have been to New Zealand have seen it. And now Spartina is all but eradicated from New Zealand. And it illustrates, the interactions with these plants illustrate the changing attitudes of society, our ethos, our motivations, and what we care about and what we value in the environment. So let's look at some of the invasions. These are the native species in 1491. There was one in California, Spartina foliosa, 5 on the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf Coast of the United States, up here. Oh boy, I shouldn't. This is a challenge. Don't ever fly with me in a small plane. And there's one native species in the eastern Atlantic, 4 down here, 1 in South Africa, and none in the Pacific, except for Spartina foliosa and this Spartina densiflora that snuck around the corner here. First invasion about in the 1650 or so to Portugal. boom, a hybridization with a native. 1850, about another one from the Atlantic zone of Atlantic intertidal of the United States to Britain, another hybridization, 2 hybridizations. Then another up north of the native range from Chile, no hybridization. An incidental introduction of Spartina alterniflora into Willapa Bay about 1900 by the first transcontinental railroads. The seed was most likely in barrels of live oysters that were being transported from New York Harbor to Willapa Bay. There's a wonderful California Department of Fish and Game publication from the 60s that describes similar introductions into California, where there wasn't a successful introduction probably, and it's a very, very interesting story. To Australia and New Zealand, to Australia and New Zealand, another one's to Australia and New Zealand, more to Australia and New Zealand, aha, then the one to San Francisco Bay from the East Coast that Deborah and I have written about many times, the Spartina alterniflora into San Francisco Bay, and boom, 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 lots of hybridizations. And that is a very long and interesting story. But we're going to try to talk about San Francisco. I'm going to try to focus, it's hard for me to focus on anything, but try to focus on San Francisco estuary and California clapper rail, which is the one of the most important conservation concerns going today. It is a vessel into which people pour all of their feelings about non-native species and environmental management. There was an editorial in the New York Times that mentioned the ironies of Spartina, hybrid Spartina control in San Francisco Bay just a couple of weeks ago. This is a really big one. The estuary contains 70% of the remaining mudflats in California. Lots, you know, the lion's share of them are gone, even in San Francisco Bay, and they've had real estate built on them south of San Francisco Bay. It hosts, the mudflats host 1 million migrating shorebirds in fall, second only to Alaska in importance in the Pacific Coast Flyway. Western Hemisphere, these are all capital, this is a proper noun, Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. It has the highest possible rating for conservation concern. Concerning these shorebirds, the open intertidal mud and native Spartina foliosa are their feeding areas. That's where you see them. I'll show you some pictures of them in these areas. Now, the dense, tall Spartina, hybrid Spartina alterniflora bifoliosa excludes these. And that, Deborah and I and other people discovered by the early 90s, that stuff was spreading like mad onto this open mud. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I would say with great wisdom and great insight, along with the California Department of Fish and Game at that time, convened and through the auspices of the California Coastal Conservancy began an herbicide campaign that was, I would say, a 99.9% success in saving the habitat for these shorebirds. However, it created collateral damage. This was a two-edged sword because the California clapper rail, which is today known as the Ridgeway Rail, loves the stuff. So these are the birds whose habitat was saved. Some of them, I think there are about 35 species of them. They're really wonderful. Everybody loves them, and you can spend days walking along the shore looking at them. Okay? This is what that hybrid Spartina looked like. And in the advertisement for this talk, I showed you a photograph taken by Eric Grijalva of patches of this stuff invading native marshes, a photograph taken from a helicopter, photograph taken in the mid-2000s. So this is Katie Zaremba, has worked with us. She's now working for the Invasive Spartina project. We see in the background Spartina alterniflora seed. of this stuff that was introduced by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1970s into San Francisco Bay. For what reason? Who knows? And then native cordgrass, Spartina foliosa, and this interface occurred in Blackie's pasture in, where is it, Tiburon or Sausalito? Tiburon. Another shot from about the same time shows Katy and hybrid Spartina in another place. And so the hybrid Spartina is much denser, much taller, much more aggressive than either of the parents. It resembles more the invasive parent than the native parent, but it's really tall, tough stuff and sets a lot of seed, and it takes off across the intertidal. And this is why the Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Game wanted to remove it. And the collateral damage was the non-migratory California, what you would know as the California clapper rail, unless you're an ornithologist, and within the last 15 months or something, it's become the Ridgeway Rail, and don't you love these taxonomists? So the Ridgeway Rail populations declined drastically in the first half of the 20th century. They were hunted and served in the best restaurants in San Francisco. Their eggs were collected and served there and elsewhere. And the habitat was removed to agriculture and urbanization. Those of you who drive along 37 toward Mare Island can see some habitat being rebuilt with the Cullinan Island operations. Very, very interesting. The trouble is very dangerous if you want to watch. You have to get somebody to drive and you can watch. There are a few places to pull over. And I was recently told by a colleague at the USGS that the thing you're driving on is the levee that was built to polderize all of the habitat inland, all the way to Napa, all the way to the mountains, that was transformed into agriculture and residential land. And when you look out toward San Pablo Bay, you see this large mud flat, and that's all sediment that's accumulated against that polder, against that levee in the last 120 years. And what the Cullinan Ranch is trying to do is improve the habitat for all kinds of birds, mainly birds inland from that levee. I was told last week by a person who is in the, California Department of Transportation, that there is movement to try to find the money to remove the levee and make an elevated causeway along the whole area, which would just be magnificent, be very expensive. So anyway, it's extinct, the Ridgeway Rail, except in San Francisco Bay. It began to recover in the habitat provided by the tall Spartina foliosa that spread across the bay in the 1970s. This was only barely known and imperfectly agreed upon, and there was great contention about this. As early as when the spraying began in 2004, I met a person from your agency. I wish I could remember his name. I searched and searched my field notes. He was the head bird guy at Mare Island. I can't remember his name. A guy he had gray hair and a flat top. Anyway, I had the opportunity of riding in a shuttle to the San Francisco airport to him, and we started talking, and he said he spent a career in the salt marsh, and those birds, those clapper rail, love that tall stuff. And that was heterodox. That was not chapter and verse. And when you read the original environmental impact statement, they go back and forth. They can't make up their mind about it. Different places, they say different things. But now we know that it's densest in hybrid Spartina. If you want to preserve clapper rail, grow big patches of hybrid Spartina. And the herbicide treatment between 2005 and 2011 widely removed the hybrid Spartina from the intertidal mud. It preserved the habitat of shorebirds. As I said, it's a great success. It probably caused, I think we're close enough, there's enough circumstantial evidence to say that it caused decreases in rail populations. And I'm sort of on the edge of my expertise. There are at least two people in the room here, Corey Overton and Toby Romer, know a lot more about this than I do, and certainly people in your agency and people at Point Blue and people in the USGS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service know a lot more about the birds than I do. I know a lot about the Spartina and its eradication. The reason that tall, dense Spartina is liked by the birds is it provides foraging areas in the creeks that are carved through it, foraging areas that are deep and predators can't see the birds from top, and it provides refuge from predators at high tide. Hybrid Spartina created a refuge for the Ridgeway Rail. It's an endangered species. There are about 2,000 left. Probably this year there are fewer. They thrive in hybrid Spartina, and they disappear from areas where hybrid Spartina has been killed. I'm going to bail out here and show you a USGS. Where did it go? A USGS. It disappeared. Where is it? Where'd it go? A USGS video of the refuge that hybrid. Is it? There it is. Okay, I got it now. I got it. I can do it. Now this is a video that was given me by Corey Overton. I think it's a USGS video. And what we're going to do is we're going to see the tide come in at China Camp. This is all Spartina foliosa. There is no hybrid Spartina here. And we're going to see the habitat where Clapper Ridgeway Rail live disappear during a king tide. And if it's during the daytime, that means that avian predators are flying overhead and can easily pick off the Ridgeway Rail. So, happy hunting. Now, of course, this doesn't illustrate everything that's going on, because there isn't a big berm there that was built. There's a side of a mountain, so it doesn't really illustrate how the system worked before. Oh, I got to get back over here, get on camera. Before the transformation of the high intertidal into agricultural and urban urban occupation. The tide would come up and the birds would simply retreat up the shore. And there was always vegetation for them to retreat into. Now they retreat up against a berm, or in this case, up against the side of a mountain, and there's no habitat for them to escape predators. Okay, statements about controlling invasive Spartina. In the upper left, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defending the Willapa Bay National Wildlife Refuge have expended multiple millions of dollars, and they found that the effective to use these amphibious lawnmowers. At high tide, they are anchored, and the operators take a little boat and go in and have lunch. At low tide, they come back out and they mow it down in year one. In year two, in the lower left, you see them spraying imazapyr on the stuff that grows back. And then in year three, it comes down to the organic gardening phase, where you get the few little patches left that have survived. And there are extraordinary data on the return of shorebirds to these areas that have been where the invasive Spartina alterniflora has been removed. In Australia, they've used more expensive techniques. This is putting black plastic over it. It works. You mow it down and then put black plastic over it. And the right panel, we see an operation by the Invasive Spartina project in San Francisco Bay, surgically removing a patch of invasive Spartina. It's a photograph from Eric Grijalva, and he a student in our lab now, and he designed this device for lowering down and not avoiding the deliverance of herbicide on plants around that weren't targeted. So this to me is the slide that brings it home. We see many, many shorebirds foraging above what is about the end of the high intertidal. It's about mean tidal level in the Emeryville Crescent, right behind the fire station on Powell Street at Emeryville. And this was a heavily infested area that the Invasive Spartina project has completely removed non-native Spartina from. And that line would be about where that really dense Spartina would be growing now if they hadn't done that. So those shorebirds are quite happy that that happened, but the clapper rail isn't. This is shot from the survey results of the Invasive Spartina project, showing what the habitat looked like where non-native Spartina was removed by herbicides. Now, it's really interesting to know that Eric Grijalva, who is the head spraymeister, in 2004, 2005, spent many hours with Joy Albertson at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Refuge in San Francisco Bay, the Don Edwards Refuge. They talked and talked and talked, and they were both certain that they both were very sure that when the invasive Spartina was removed, the native vegetation would recolonize quickly. And both of them say, I haven't talked to Joy, but Eric says, we were wrong. And that's what it looked like for a year, 2 years after it was sprayed. Even the pickleweed didn't run down. And so now a large fraction of the resources of the Invasive Spartina project are being dedicated to revegetation of these areas. And that's a major endeavor and a major research topic. And the recolonization of revegetated areas by clapper rail is little known at this point. So both Toby and Corey are here. I had no idea that they would be here. They showed together in a series of, Toby in his master's thesis and Corey in a paper that I've had the good fortune to participate in, that the Ridgeway Rail survivorship is 73% higher in hybrid Spartina areas before herbiciding than after. And there are similar differences before herbicide hybrid versus native California foliosa that wasn't sprayed. And in the lower panel, we see the Spartina inventory in green, and from the Invasive Spartina project, the clapper rail count over that period. Okay, I'd finish up with an interesting, another really interesting chapter that goes beyond San Francisco Bay. The largest Spartina invasion in the world is the second most recent. The most recent probably is South Africa. It's a tiny one in one little estuary. In China, from 1980 on, over 19 degrees of latitude have been invaded from North Korea to south of Hong Kong to Hainan Island. It's an order of magnitude larger invasion than any other. They tried several times, over and over again, and finally they got it right. 3 different provenances of Spartina alterniflora were introduced from North Carolina, from Georgia, and from Florida. They were planted out in this place at Fuzhou in a place called Luoyuan Bay in Fujian province, which is to the north, just at the north end of Taiwan. They planted out and just selected the biggest ones, the fastest growing ones, and they spread them around all over China. And we don't really know what the evolution is like that's going on there. I've been working with the Chinese scientists for several years about this, and it appears that there hasn't been much evolution yet. The interesting part of this story that I'd like to relate today is not about the evolution there, but about the effect on people's lives of this introduction. So we see the map in the upper left, and the arrow points to Zhang Zhang estuary. Please correct me, those Mandarin speakers. Fujian, I can get right. Fujian province, China. In the supertidal, this is the most heavily utilized habitat in the world. You can't believe it when you look at it on Google Earth. Every square inch has something growing on it and people cultivating it. In the supertidal, there are rice and vegetables. In the intertidal, there are clams, crabs, and oysters. And there are attempts by environmental groups and weak attempts by the government to preserve the mangroves. However, people tear the mangroves out because they want to use that spot to grow or to practice their mariculture. And in the upper right, there's a really interesting, I hope you can see, it's a comb-shaped, even from just the crudest Google Earth, you can see these comb-shaped intertidal areas. And on the lower right, you can see up close what they look like. And I'm going to show you some photographs and tell you a story about this place in Zhang Zhang estuary that's right in the middle of the lower left. It looks like an island, and this is an artificial island that's been built for mariculture. These are the wealthy people who get to work on this island. The poorer people are working on the mud around the island. The island has weirs and tide gates to maximize the growth rate of the mariculture organisms. So here's in one of those combs, and you can see who does the work. And you can see that these are long hours. This photograph was taken about 11 o'clock in the morning when the women were coming in from their mariculture activities for lunch. And here they are. They invited us, and we were guests we had our graduate students and professors from Xiamen University who are showing us around. And they're well fed, they have lots to eat, they live on the island, and the men were smoking cigarettes over on the left and sort of ordering people around. This was a fun time. I was taking some pictures, and the woman, this woman here, said in Mandarin to a graduate student who was next to me, says, "Tell him to stop taking pictures, we don't like that." And then they all laughed. And so I said to my graduates, I tell her that I'm a famous director from Hollywood and I'm going to make a movie of this. And she shot back immediately. And I looked around at all of my graduate students. All of these people are saying they were extremely embarrassed. So I stopped and I thought, ooh, this must be transgressing something. And then later in the car, I said, what did she say? What did she say? And one of the guys finally said, she said, "Yes, and I'm Mao's fifth wife." So it was great fun. There's a product of their work. There's a razor clams being guarded by a vicious dog, and they're worth a lot of money. But here's the consequence of this interaction between no one knows who introduced Spartina there. It is actually invading mangroves. It's extremely valuable in protecting the shore from typhoons, and this particular place has an average of a typhoon every other year, in which people flee, and the fields closest, if it's a big one, the supertidal fields closest are ruined. They lose all the crops. And so the mangroves are very valuable, and you can see here Spartina alterniflora invading mangrove. This is the first known example of that, and it's all because people tear the mangroves down, and then the Spartina spreads by seed into these areas. If the mangroves were not molested, Spartina probably would just grow around the edge. And finally, I'll finish up by showing you Well, the people on the islands are in pretty good shape, but the poorer people have to conduct their mariculture out on the open mud, and you can see the consequence of the Spartina invasion for their endeavors. And I'll finish up with that. Oh, I've got these wrong. There are lots of people who've worked on this. Toby's here, Corey's here, Deborah here, and all these other people, probably more. I've left some out. And so with that, I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you for that. So we'll take questions now. If you're on WebEx, you can type questions in and we'll read them. And if you're here in the room, I will pass around the microphone if you have a question, and this is so that people who are participating on WebEx can hear your question as well. So, anybody in the room have a question?
Yes, thanks, Don. What is the status of the biological opinion of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Can Spartina control happen, or has it been suspended?
There are people in this room that know a lot more about that than I do. Toby's closest. Maybe he doesn't want to comment.
Throughout the vast majority of the bay, control is continuing. There are 10 marshes that are clustered around Oakland and Hayward where treatment has been suspended. And so Spartina is proliferating there and potentially sending out seed elsewhere. So it definitely complicates the control issue. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does.
Okay.
Any other questions?
There's one.
China has a very different problem, largely because you said the scale of the problem there is so much different. Their proposed solutions are also proportionally larger. Do you know what the status of some of those plans are?
I actually know a lot about it, but not as much as one would need to know to say. I think first, it is a political, everything in China is political, and it's political first, okay? And so there has to be a reason, a political reason for conservation to happen. And we saw last week that President Obama was able to negotiate agreements of reducing CO2 pollution with the chairman of the Communist Party, and he was able to do that because the political situation with pollution in China is so bad that it has to be dealt with. And the most immediate, of course, problem in China with air pollution isn't CO2. It's particulates. And so those of you who've been to China recently, it's far worse than Los Angeles ever was in the 1960s. You can Google it up and look at the picture of Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and various other cities today. And they live in a fog that looks like Pittsburgh in 1950 and looks like London in about 1948. It's a horrible problem with PM 2.5 and with other related air pollution problems with sulfur and nitrogen coming from burning coal. Right? So that's an example that something really big can happen. Whether Spartina isn't, in China there are, okay, since I finished fairly early, I can tell you an anecdote. When I first went over, I was giving an earlier naive version of this talk in which I emphasized the evolution of Spartina and how it might be happening in China. And audience, hundreds of people would show up when I'd go from university to university, and most of them didn't speak English. until you get closer and closer to Hong Kong. And the universities in the south, most of the students would speak English. And one of the first things, I said, why is this? And he says, we grew up watching television from Hong Kong. My mother made me watch television from Hong Kong. But when you get to as far north as Beijing, most of the people don't speak English. Only academics who've spent a lot of time in English-speaking countries do. And so in that audience in Beijing at the Institute of Agriculture, there were probably 300 people, and I guess trying to talk to people that maybe 10% could understand what I said. And after the talk, there was an old man in the back, and I could see he looked. It was, by then I wasn't surprised to see people in Mao suits, and I think those of you who haven't been in China a lot, there are lots and lots of people in China who Mao is a god. And especially old people will dress up to look like him, and people who've been in the military will dress up in Mao suits. And this guy came down, he looked like Mao Zedong. And he had medals. He was very old, and he had 3 or 4 handlers with him, and he was introduced to me as the person who was the party member who was responsible for the introduction of Spartina to China. And he was very, very important for that reason. So there's an age difference. They're older people who are involved with spreading it around, older people who have published on its all of the great things it can do for the Chinese people, who still think it's a great thing. The younger generation sees its effect on modifying the shore and its negative effects on the biota, as I've shown you with the invasion of salt marshes. So first it's a political thing, then as Corey pointed out, it's a scale. There's an area near Shanghai called Chongmingdongtan, which is, part of that means wildlife refuge. And it's a very, very large area where Spartina is encroaching upon native vegetation, and its major threat isn't to wildlife, although the biologists report on that and who study it and find it. Its major threat is to the poor people who live on that shore. And it prevents them from their mariculture activities. So the government of China built a levee that's about 20 kilometers long. And they built it mainly with labor. There was some heavy equipment, but mainly hand labor. And then it was closed, and they flooded it with fresh water. After people, by hand, macheted down the Spartina, flooded it with fresh water, and killed the invading Spartina. And it's considered to be a grand success, and there are people now, fish traps, and all kinds of mariculture activities going on, and every few years they'll go out and by hand cut the Spartina again. The last part of that question is really interesting, because although they use huge amounts of herbicide and insecticide in fields right up to salt marshes, they have to date refused to use herbicides to control Spartina, and we know how to control Spartina with herbicides really, really well. We've demonstrated that in Willapa Bay, where it's virtually 2,000 hectares are virtually gone. There's virtually no Spartina left in Willapa Bay. Washington and San Francisco Bay, we can kill it, and we know that. And I've asked and asked and asked people about why they don't consider using herbicides, and even close colleagues, I can't get anything except sort of a, let's go, I know a restaurant with some good food. It's a political matter, and they won't go there. And I don't know the answer. And maybe it's different in different places, but they have to date refused to use herbicides. Here's one.
I wanted to go back in your presentation a little bit where you showed a figure which showed a very dire trend for clapper rails. Sorry,
Right.
California Ridgeway Rail.
It's right there.
And I just want to kind of clarify that that's from one very specific site and is not necessarily representative of the whole bay. This site, prior to invasion by hybrid, was a mudflat and so provided no habitat for rails. And so, yes, once it moved in, they flourished, and when it was removed, they moved on. So I just wanted to make that clear.
So are they doing better in other places?
There are plenty of places around the bay where it was old, mature marsh. So Greco Island South, McInnes Marsh, La Riviere, where even concurrent with pretty dramatic removal, invasion and removal of hybrid, rail populations have been stable.
They've been stable. Have they recovered?
Standards of recovery. In some areas, so Dunbar and Audubon, birds are about twice the density that they were prior to invasion. So there are examples of this, but I mean, bay-wide numbers are not necessarily coming back up. I just wanted to point out that.
So, Toby, is there any place where that has been rehabilitated, revegetated, where they've come back?
So vast majority of the places where rails disappeared from are in areas where it was either where no habitat existed prior to invasion or it was suboptimal. So sites like fairly young restoration sites like Cogswell, it was not a mature marsh prior to the invasion. So it was pretty much just pickleweed plain, which does not provide very much cover for rails from predation. It also doesn't provide much nesting substrate. So in those ones, those are also most of the sites where we're no longer able to treat, so there's still a lot of hybrid there. And so in those sites, yeah, rails are pretty dependent upon the hybrid. Other sites, like there are several in Eden Landing where we've been doing, sorry, I'm with the Invasive Spartina project, so when I say we, that's us. I've been doing a lot of native plant introduction, so putting a lot of grindelia, it's a marsh gum plant which birds will use for nesting, as well as distinctless, and also experimenting with introducing Spartina foliosa, the native Spartina. In those areas, the plants are doing really well, and what it seems to be doing, and this is all very young in the process, it's kind of bumping up the time frame for when a marsh can be restored to tidal action to when it might function more as a mature marsh. But we've only been doing this for a few years, so it's difficult to really say in the long run. But plants are doing really well. Hopefully the birds will follow soon.
Yeah, I failed to mention that in Corey's work with the USGS, they have floating islands that provide refuge at high tide, and they're working with making little artificial berms. And I think that maybe Corey could comment on this, but I think that the initial, I know from a publication that has come out, that there are some optimistic signs. Is that true? Give him the microphone.
There's been use of those islands by rails.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, rails will use them to hide from when the tides come up.
Here, just a second, Corey.
Okay. Kind of just like how rail population responds to Spartina eradication depends on what else is around the matrix. If it was mudflat and it's gone back to mudflat, rails aren't going to do very well. What's around the artificial islands is going to influence how well those islands are going to be used. There's no rails, you don't get much use. If there's a lot of alternative native habitat, you don't get a lot of use. And in spots where you don't have a lot of habitat, either because of natural native conditions, there's just not a lot of habitat, or kind of a near-term immediate response to Spartina spraying, you can get a very definite response. So the answer is, yeah, we do get a lot of use in the situations where use would be expected. You don't get a lot of use where you wouldn't expect it. So they'll help out somewhat, but it's kind of a stopgap measure. if you don't have good habitat, the other 99% of the time, having a piece of ground protected from a high tide isn't going to help that much.
Yeah, I think the story, from my point of view, it looks to me like this will be a very, very long-term management concern. If the state of California cuts off the funding, nobody's going to count the birds, probably, and Toby will be out of a job, and we won't know, and there'll be resurgence of invasive Spartina in those areas where the spraying is being conducted now. And then, you know, I had a student in my lab, and unfortunately she never published this, Laura Feinstein, who worked for years with the tiniest plants that were that the Invasive Spartina project was worrying about spraying. And she would look at their genetics, and there was a substantial fraction of them that looked like native Spartina foliosa that were loaded with genes of the hybrid. And so that we called cryptic hybrid. And the notion is, even if you removed, which is not anywhere near reality, even if you removed all of the really large, coarse, dense stuff, which is obviously hybrid, then perhaps it could come back from crossing of the cryptic hybrids. We don't know the answer to that. And so there's a huge number of hybrid genes still in that, and over very large areas in that bay. And so it looks to me like the state and the federal government and other groups have a long-term obligation to both the shorebirds and to the clapper rail, as well as there are other aspects in San Francisco Bay that are, for example, there's stormwater control, as I mentioned, and there's mosquito control, and there's access to the shore, and various navigational situations where the sediment is moved around. There is rehabilitation or mitigation in the Cargill salt ponds that hybrid Spartina will interact with, and so it is part of the equation now, and it seems to me it's going to be part of the equation for the indefinite future. It's not going to go away. And I will say one really optimistic, really cool management strategy that ISP and Eric Grijalva developed is light spraying with a particular herbicide mixtures in areas at a certain time and certain tide of the year that didn't kill the plant but prevented it from setting seed. And so that would have presumably preserved the habitat for clapper rail and prevented the spread of seed into other areas. That's much more that's pretty expensive operation for doing that on a large scale, but it's one tactic that is pretty promising.
Hi, I used to work with the Invasive Spartina project as well. And
what's your name? Huh? Yeah. I recognize your name from reports.
Yeah. So it's been a long time since I've thought about all of this stuff, but there's another interesting layer. There are other tidal marsh bird species in the San Francisco Bay who could be impacted by the invasive Spartina or the Spartina hybrid. And Toby may need to correct me because I haven't thought about it in so many years. Colleen Nordby conducted some research with Jen McBroom on the Alameda song sparrow to look at their nesting success in invaded versus non-invaded areas. And they didn't go so far as to say that it's an ecological trap, but it seems as though the invasive Spartina was offering substrate for the the Alameda song sparrow to nest in, yet the problem was that it was allowing the nest to be flooded more often. So there are these other interesting elements. And Toby, do you want to add anything to that?
It's true. I mean, I feel like when it comes to management, control, or eradication of hybrid Spartina, we always talk about Ridgeway Rails, but there are also other endangered species around. Most notably, saltmarsh harvest mouse that is obligate on pickleweed. Well, if you do have hybrid come in, it forms a monoculture, and it gets rid of basically all the pickleweed. It ruins all of the saltmarsh harvest mouse habitat. But Ridgeway Rails are much easier to do surveys for than harvest mice are, and so you just don't really have much of a baseline. You don't know what numbers are. So not much research. So there's some research going on right now to look into that. But also threatened California black rails. They do not do very well in hybrid. I imagine it would also affect saltmarsh yellowthroat. Yeah. So there are definitely other species to consider. There's just not as much known about them as there is for Ridgeway Rails. Deborah.
Okay, I'm gonna put out there that I realize we're concerned about the animals, but when you lose the genetic integrity of a very important native species, Spartina foliosa, that is also a cause for concern. I was thinking years ago that it might be a candidate for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act as threatened with extinction, at least in San Francisco Bay, by hybridization. So let's, put on our plant glasses too. And so now I have a question for the ISP. Given that you now have, did you say 11 populations of hybrids in the bay?
No, there are 11 being sprayed.
11 marshes that are not being sprayed?
Not being.
There are 10 marshes that are clustered together that are not being sprayed. And there's one other site in South Bay that is getting the seed suppression, that light herbicidal spray, so that it doesn't produce seed.
So we're doing birth control for Spartina, basically.
Basically. And it's a part of a 3-year study to figure out.
So given that from one hybridization site, possibly 2, the hybrids blew out of those marshes and took over the bay, essentially. Now you have 10 fires burning. You have 10 marshes where hybrid seed can blow out of those marshes. How in the world are you going to control hybrid Spartina? And it's like trying to control a forest fire, but letting 10 fires burn in the forest and watching them very carefully.
I agree. It's very difficult. We survey all this. Right now, we do not have the ability to be able to, pick up one plant sample and say, "Oh, this definitely came from that seed source." But looking at shorelines adjacent to Hayward and San Leandro Bay, new seedlings are coming in all the time. So seed has to come from somewhere, and seedlings that have been genetically identified as hybrid. So these seeds need to be coming from somewhere, presumably from these 2 clustered big sources in Hayward and San Leandro. So yeah, we're monitoring every inch of shoreline around there, and it's problematic. I don't know how best to answer your question. It's exactly how you describe it.
So what happens when the Coastal Conservancy defunds the ISP?
Anybody else want to answer that?
Is it going to go on forever?
I have no answer for that. The long-term, there is stuff in development right now. Long-term management is for responsibility to shift to smaller agencies and land stewards, but beyond some education of agencies and interested parties, that hasn't happened yet, and that's all stuff to be developed in the future.
So the only strategy that avoids having to manage marshes through seed control as habitat for Willapa Rail, are you kidding me? What? The only strategy that gets us out of the Spartina control business is eradication of hybrids. And yet that has been taken off the plate by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who's somehow trying to keep things in stasis that will not stay in stasis. There has to be funding poured into this every year from now until forever, or the bay will get invaded by hybrid cordgrass and it will completely change.
Hildy's got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering if somebody, and maybe it's Toby, could explain so about the habitat restoration efforts that are going on now. So did the Fish and Wildlife Service halt the eradication of Spartina until alternative habitat is restored? Or can you explain to everybody, because that might be helpful?
Yeah. So there is kind of a trigger, which would be for 3 consecutive years, annual call count survey numbers for Ridgeway Rails to be 80 above what they were in 2010 at the same sites that were 80 rails. So I cannot remember the number offhand right now, and so I'm not going to make up a number and have that stick in anybody's head. But so whatever the number X was in 2010 for call counts, 2011, 12, and 13 would need to be 80 above that. And at that point, that does not mean that treatment can resume. That means that discussion, it will reopen, kind of, not negotiation, but it will reevaluate, reassess what's going on with rails and hybrid Spartina and try and figure out paths to go down. And that's between Coastal Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife Service, ISP. Yeah.
Just one more question. What is the role of the Department of Fish and Wildlife in those negotiations, do you know? Since you're talking to a lot of department staff.
Several people are consistently a part of those discussions. We have an annual meeting, we meet with them. Obviously permitting, we certainly need to renew with you guys. Beyond that, not entirely sure. Sorry.
I just wanted to bring in a slight counterpoint and a slightly different history. There's 2 different timescales that we're talking about with rail populations. The 2010 number that has now become this kind of baseline for management decisions is also half. That population in 2010 is half of what populations were in 2007, as a point of reference, in terms of the numbers of rails that were counted in the bay. And that it is also several times what populations were prior to the invasion. 1991, before the invasion really ramped up, there were estimates of a few hundred rails in San Francisco Bay. The concept that going back to that native habitat condition is going to give you any other results than a few hundred rails in the bay, I think is kind of fraught with difficulty. That's not to say that rails are not sustainable in the bay, but replacing what is there now with what was there in 1990 or 1975 or 1960 is probably not going to allow you to keep rails in San Francisco Bay.
Consider also, though, at the same time, there are very large restoration projects going on, both in North Bay and in South Bay, and even central South Bay.
What are you going to make that's different than what rails were living in before and not surviving?
It's actually just the provision of more area, more habitat for birds to live in. I mean, the main decline in rails occurred because we levied all of the land we converted to our agriculture and salt pond production and airports, and that was the main reason the rails declined. And introduction of red fox, which really did a number on rails in the early 90s.
That's a very, very simplistic determination of what caused rails to decline. I agree with you that that's a major part of it, but there's much more involved than just that. And putting 95% of the habitat within a few hundred feet of the bay edge is a bigger issue. I agree that restoration can improve a lot of those conditions, but we've got a long ways to go to understand what needs to be made before we can say we're going to make it and the rails are going to do fine. So we don't even know what to make yet. So we're doing restoration, but we don't
have a prescription for what that habitat is.
For sure, and that's exactly where we stand. We don't know all of these things.
Yeah, I think this is really important. These two people know more about clapper rail than there probably aren't. I'm guessing there are 4 other people in the world that know as much as they do. So we have a discussion between 2 of the experts on this issue. Maybe Jen McBroom could get in there and duke it out, and a couple of other people, but they're retiring and going off and moving to Washington Island and things like that. So these guys, when they're talking like this is the way forward, listening to these kinds of arguments. I'm sure I'm insulting somebody by not including them, but this is a really, really interesting, as well as being a tremendous challenge, it's a really interesting issue because there are so many elements of it, and currently we're getting a lot of information. The real chilling, horrible specter would be if the state of California cut off funding without an alternative funding source to pick up the activities, these mitigation activities, these marsh rehabilitation activities, and actual biology of the rail work. So this is pretty interesting.
I have a question. When the red foxes invaded, it seemed that the rails might have used the Sassoon marsh, which is more brackish and not so much Spartina, but bulrush and other vegetation. And I'm wondering, in the absence of hybrid Spartina, could the Sassoon marsh be an important place for the rails to actually colonize and use that brackish vegetation?
Well, I don't think there aren't very many of them there. Is that true?
Correct.
And so why that's true, I mean, in places where you think there should be lots and lots of them, there aren't very many, like the Petaluma River, right?
The Petaluma River is also very brackish.
It's not.
So you tend to get less rails the more fresh water you get. So even though
The last 3 years, the Petaluma River has been pretty damn salty.
But it's lined with escarpus and tule, and you got portions of
Okay, it's ag runoff then, and then you think is putting fresh water in?
Plenty of birds up in Petaluma Marsh.
Okay.
That very large marsh tract, not super high density, but there are lots of birds in there. Even as far as pretty close to like downtown Petaluma, you get birds up there. We'll detect them on annual surveys. So they're there. But back to the original question about Sassoon, not all that many surveys are conducted up there, which would be really nice to get extra funding to be able to survey those areas. We don't really think there are many birds up there, probably because it is too brackish, but that Sassoon Marsh could absolutely serve as where birds move to as we deal with sea level rise and becomes less brackish. But, I mean, I don't know how to predict that.
Yeah, I don't. I just did a review. I don't think that the salinity is going to migrate with the sea level rise in San Francisco Bay. I think that probably the salinity levels will remain pretty close to what they are. But anyway, we don't have enough beer to discuss that.
Although the Ridgeway Rail is no longer the clapper rail, they at least used to be the same. And, on the East Coast, there are plenty of opportunities for clapper rail to migrate up into fresh water, and they don't.
Good point.
In areas, they have the king rail that is kind of the freshwater analog, but they're considered separate species, and never, except for a small band of hybridization, they don't really meet. Whether that's because of salinity in the water, or whether that's because of differences in tidal inundation, both interplay, and both, you can't really separate the two. I think given the kind of poor track history that Sassoon has for maintaining rail populations, it's pretty difficult to put a lot of money that's going to be where the bulk of the rail population is in 50 years or 100 years, since since they haven't shown that capability yet. That said, that may be all that's left. So, you know, I don't want to say that it's not possible, but they haven't been able to.
Yeah, sea level rise is going to play out in this story on a much at a much slower rate than the conservation year-to-year conservation efforts we've been talking about here. And so if you can't get it right in a decade of really trying, that's pretty scary. And it's really interesting. There are now 2 major theory papers on this. And they come to opposite conclusions. One says, oh, if you spend your money right, it's all, you know, you can key the violins and everything will be wonderful. The other one says, we're screwed and they're going extinct, anything we do. And I think another element of this is we're attracting all kinds of interest from other quarters. This is a really big issue that many, many people know about. Most people don't know very much about it, and they have a lot to say, more to say when they know less. But it's a really big conservation issue. And the earlier answer, I mean, I think that, from my point of view, I think that Department of California Fish and Wildlife could play a larger role in this if they care to assert themselves. I think that USGS would love it. I think ISP would love it.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for